So what I want to do today is I want to talk about wrist positions, and I want to look at it with relationship to my golf swing and in a little bit more detail. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to use Hack Motion. Hack Motion is a device that you guys can buy as well, and it basically just measures, well, your arm, how your relationship of your forearm and your wrist, if you like, your hand, move in space. So I've been talking a lot recently about wrist conditions, and hopefully today's video will just explain exactly the mistake I think most amateurs are making when it comes to wrist positions and how important your body rotation is as well. So what we'll notice, if I sort of just hit a little shot here to get it going, like so. So what we'll always notice with golfers is in the beginning position, you'll normally start in a state of extension, okay, which basically means my wrist is angled this way. But when we hit the golf ball, we often end up in a state of flexion, right? Which basically means the hands are moving ahead of the ball. The big reason why that's happening is because we're more open. So our shoulders, our chest and our pelvis are more open at impact than obviously they are at address. So if I sort of got set up and my shoulders are square and my wrist is like so, and then I hit it and my shoulders are, say, anything from 10 to 15 degrees open, then obviously my wrist is going to flatten. So for somebody like myself, who at impact has quite a large amount of flexion, the reason why I have quite a large amount of flexion is because of how open my chest and my shoulders are at that impact area. And therefore my wrists are helping me keep that club on plane as I open up my body. Now maybe a better way of looking at this is if you imagine I got set up and I had the wrist angle like so, and then I hit the golf ball with the same square shoulders and square chest, then obviously I'm going to return into the same wrist position. And therefore I'm going to produce what would be known as more of a scooping action because of the lack of rotation through the ball. So what I'm saying is I meet a lot of golfers who consciously try and manipulate the wrist positions. What I'm trying to say is that your wrist positions, yes, they need an element of consciousness, but you're not going to be able to change your wrist positions unless you're pivoting well. So with all of my online students, the ones that have questions about the wrist positions, the first thing I'm getting them to do is do the basics of turning, retaining hip depth and opening up the body, because once they can start to open up the body, this then lends the opportunity to playing around with wrist positions to help them keep that golf club moving, should we say, on plane, okay? So that's a big thing. Now, what about the backswing though? Okay, because that's where I get quite a lot of questions as well, because obviously we see a variety. And I've really enjoyed watching the comments on the channel recently, and I get a lot of people saying, well, why don't you just flex in the address position? You can. What worries me with most golfers is why I've started this video as I have, is because I tend to think a lot of golfers tend to do things like flex the wrist and flatten the wrist, but they don't rotate through the golf ball very well, so they still end up scooping, and it feels like you're doing something better, but maybe you're not really doing it. But again, that's for you guys to be judging. The big part of this message is make sure you are open, and therefore that's going to lend itself to having good angles at the point of impact. Backswing then, in terms of what's happening with myself. I produce flexion in the backswing, okay, which basically means as my wrist position starts like so, by the time I get to the top of the backswing, my left wrist is flexing. Why is that happening? Well, I would say that's happening, it's not happening massively soon, okay, all of the time. It's happening more at the top of the backswing position. The reason for this, and this is when it gets maybe a little more complicated, is because the swing thought that works really well for me is just to take the club straight back and sort of straight down. But the problem with that is if I literally just take the club straight back and straight down, you can see how steep the club would be. But if I take the club straight back and then I get the feeling of carrying it on straight back, but I flex the wrist, you can see the way that helps me keep the club on plane. So what's happening for me to produce flexion at the top is, yes, there's going to be a bit of this type of motion as we've seen, but what I'm also trying to do is I'm trying to get the feeling of reducing my arm rotation. So I'm not trying to have a massive amount of arm rotation of the backswing. I'm trying to feel like the back of my lead forearm is pointing more to the ground and then producing a bit of flexion, because it feels like it's easier to get that club moving straight and straight as opposed to straight and then excessive rotation. But that's something you can play around with. What we know with professional golfers is that there are some that hinge the wrists early. There are some that hinge the wrist at the top of the backswing. There are some that maintain the wrist positions at the top, and then they flatten coming in towards the downswing. And there are some that maintain the wrist conditions all the way until pre-impact, and then they create that flattening. So I'm not advocating this is something that you have to do with your wrist positions, but what I'm just trying to say is the big thing is all about impact and making sure you are open first and foremost before trying to play around with the wrist positions. And I think that if you start producing a good impact position, then you can start playing around with feeling of hinging the back of your trail wrist more in the backswing, introducing more flexion at the top of the backswing and then rotating through the ball. But start with the rotation first, learn that impact position. Nice little exercise to do that is just to work on that sort of feeling of holding that flex in those short swings as I do here, and just making sure you're turning that body through the golf ball, see as I'm here, and then you can start marrying up those back swings a little bit more. So hopefully you've enjoyed the video. If you are thinking about this, then start thinking more about this first and foremost, and then we'll take the journey from there. I'll see you soon.